Okay, we are back with Big Book History number 6. Today we're going to talk about We Agnostics, the 4th chapter in the Big Book. But before diving into the writing and the contents of We Agnostics, I really think it's important to pause just a little bit and to recap exactly where we are in the historical development of these chapters in the Big Book. So in short, I want to make sure we know how and where does We Agnostics fit into the unfolding story of the writing of the Big Book. Now, Bill's story was written in late May of 1938, and that was followed by There Is a Solution, which he finished by mid-June of 1938. And we've already seen what prompted those two earliest chapters, getting them written, and the extensive edits that were made to them over the next several months. That was followed by a full 3-month period where nothing more was written. So nothing got written from mid-June until mid-September of 1938. All that time, Bill and Hank were they were busy chasing testimonials. They were working to establish an alcoholic hospital down in Washington, D.C. And most especially while Bill was off doing all that, Hank was desperately running around New York City trying to raise money from the rich. And we covered all of that in much more detail in the presentation I did on More About Alcoholism. But early in September, they still haven't raised any money. The Rockefellers just aren't getting it done for them, and the possibility of that alcoholic hospital being founded and getting up and running in Washington, D.C. is completely gone. Bob's getting a small monthly check from the Rockefeller contribution of $5,000, but Bill, Hank, and Fitz are just dead broke. And I mean, we're talking dead broke and in debt. They had no income coming in whatsoever. Hank Parkhurst, of course, has a new plan. There's this Sunday newspaper supplement called This Week Magazine. It's one of those things that's printed in New York City, but it goes into newspapers, Sunday newspapers, all across the country. All kinds of different newspapers subscribe to This Week Magazine, and it shows up in a lot of people's Sunday morning delivery of the newspaper. And it's got a circulation of over 5 million copies. This is a really big deal. This thing is going out to households all across the United States of America. And in early September of 1938, one of their members, one of their people in Alcoholics Anonymous, relatively sober at this time, has an in with This Week Magazine. He's going to write an article about their cure and get it placed in the magazine. And in that article, Hank Parkhurst wants him to offer the fact that they haven't finished the book yet, but we could send you several chapters of their upcoming book for just $1. And Hank says, what, $1? I mean, who wouldn't, to save their life or to save their husband or their child's life, send you $1? I mean, it's just the price of a pint of cheap whiskey. Great bargain. But, Bill, we only got 2 chapters. We only got those 2 chapters you wrote back in May and June. And people are going to expect something more like 5 chapters for their $1. So Bill Wilson starts writing again, with this prompting from Hank Parkhurst on September 15th, 1938. Thank you, Hank, for getting this book project back going. The next 2 chapters that Bill Wilson writes are More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics. There's a certain inescapable logic. Now, this is the context again for writing these 2 chapters next. As I've already noted, when Bill wrote There Is a Solution, he clearly outlined his revolutionary diagnosis of the alcoholic's problem, and he also presented in that same chapter his suggested solution to that problem. Bill's brilliant diagnosis is that if you're a real alcoholic, you have no mental defense against the first drink. No mental defense against the first drink. Well, what does that mean? It means that sooner or later, with no booze whatsoever in your body, we're not talking about the fact that once you start drinking, you can't stop drinking. We're talking about the fact you haven't got any booze in your body whatsoever. You are still going to pick up that first drink. You have no mental defense. If you're a real alcoholic, you have no mental defense against the first drink. And as we saw in the last presentation, More About Alcoholism, the next chapter after There Is a Solution is completely focused on expanding the validity of this diagnosis of the alcoholic's basic problem. That's all he's talking about in More About Alcoholism is an expansion and a validation of this diagnosis. And he does that by repeatedly illustrating just how powerless the real alcoholic is when it comes to the first drink. And he does that with 4 different stories, if you remember. There's a story of the man of 30 who doesn't drink for a long time and ends up drinking when he retires and dies very shortly. Jim puts a whiskey in his milk. There's a crazy thing. The jaywalker is certainly nuts, leaving the hospital and still trying to jaywalk and ends up with a broken back. Sound familiar as an analogy? And Fred on his business trip to New York. So those were the 4 examples that Bill presented in More About Alcoholism to illustrate and to rub people's nose in the validity of this diagnosis he had presented. In We Agnostics, Bill's now going to deliver the promise that he made in There Is a Solution by fully describing the solution. He's already fully described the diagnosis. Now he's going to fully describe the solution of the alcoholic's problem. He's going to talk about the necessary, quote, vital spiritual experience and dealing what the reader must do to get sober. But before we launch into the writing of that particular chapter, it's important to revisit the 2 big challenges that Bill Wilson faced before he even began to write We Agnostics. The first of these was the explicit Christian environment of the Oxford group, out of which Alcoholics Anonymous grew. I mean, AA definitely grew out of the Oxford group, and we owe a lot to the Oxford group for things that go on in Alcoholics Anonymous and principles and practices of Alcoholics Anonymous, but it was an explicitly Christian movement. And in that Christian movement, there was an early belief that some form of religion, if not this particular form of religion, was the defining characteristic of the solution. So it was a religious solution. Remember that in Bill's first account, when he wrote There Is a Solution back in June of 1938, Dr. Jung tells Roland that he needs to get himself a vital religious experience. A vital religious experience, rather than the later edit to a vital spiritual experience. So there's this over the period of time from the June writing of There Is a Solution right up until the publication of the book in April of 1939, there's this fine tuning and this kind of downgrading of the emphasis on the word religious and the substitution of the word spiritual. Overall, in Bill's original version of There Is a Solution, the word religious was used 13 times and the word spiritual never occurred, didn't show up at all. But by the time the Multilith was printed in mid-February of 1939, those numbers had changed dramatically. Now religious appears just 7 times, and all the mentions of religious have nothing to do with the solution. It's just talking about religious people. And spiritual has replaced the word religious 7 times. So we're going from a very religious solution presentation to a spiritual solution presentation. So by the time we get to September 1938, it was this very religious, very Christian Oxford and group environment that was still the exclusive model of recovery out in Akron. And something we talked about at some length in the presentation I did on There Is a Solution. The sober people in Akron weren't just Christian devotees. They were solid Oxford group members. They couldn't imagine a program of recovery that would work for anybody that didn't include the 4 absolutes and a whole bunch of other Oxford group practices and principles. And as Bill was not about to write a chapter that used any of that Oxford group terminology, this was something he was definitely trying to avoid. And he wasn't even going to hint in any way that they were in any way affiliated with the Oxford group when anything he wrote. And here's the problem. 2 years earlier, Frank Bookman, the man who founded the Oxford group, his reputation had gone into serious decline when he was quoted, very, very likely out of context, but he was quoted nationally as saying, "I thank heaven for a man like Adolf Hitler, who built a front line of defense against the Antichrist of communism." So this is Bookman commenting on the fact that somebody's got to stand in the way of this anti-Christian communism, and thank God for Adolf Hitler there, kind of thing. So the Oxford group, by the time we get to the second half of 1938, is just not popular in the way that it had been, let's say, 5 years earlier. And Wilson he's going to strenuously avoid using any kind of Oxford group terminology or even hint in any way that they're affiliated with the Oxford group. And the Akron people, they're not alone in wanting a specifically Christian solution in the book. Many New Yorkers felt that way. The most vocal of these was Bill's close friend Fitz Mayo, who had returned to his Episcopalian roots and was deeply committed to a solution. The solution to my drinking problem is based on the New Testament. Coming down strongly on the other side of this huge controversy in early A was, of course, Hank Parkhurst. He was constantly challenging Bill Wilson over the religious solution that was being offered in the book. He thought that we're going in exactly the wrong direction. Hank believed that the solution was found in moral psychology, becoming more altruistic, getting your attention off of yourself and into other people, which frankly moral psychology was Dr. Silkworth's solution to the alcoholic's problem, how he could stop drinking. This, Hank Parkhurst said, would then lead to the necessary vital spiritual experience needed to maintain long-term sobriety. So this is a cart before the horse sort of thing. You need to be more altruistic. You need to practice moral psychology, and doing that leads to the vital spiritual experience. As Hank wrote in his ideas that he had jotted down in early June of 1938, when he first challenged Bill about what he was writing in the Big Book. So this is just one page out of those ideas, his observations. He says, one of the earliest, he's getting on Bill Wilson about what he's writing. One of the earliest and most talked of things about us is a religious experience. I believe that this is incomprehensible to most people. Simple and meaningful words to us, but meaningless to most of the people that we are trying to get this over to. In my mind, religious should not be brought in. We are actually irreligious. How's that for a line? We are actually irreligious. But we are trying to be helpful, moral psychology. We are trying to learn to be quiet, to be more truthful, to be more honest, to be more unselfish, moral psychology, to make the other fellow's troubles, moral psychology, our troubles, moral psychology. And by following 4 steps, most of us have a religious experience. The fellowship, the unselfishness, moral psychology, appeals to us. So this is Hank's big complaint about what Bill's putting in the book, and his suggestion for an alternate way of approaching the solution to the alcoholic's problem of having no mental defense against the first drink. This difference of opinion over what constitutes the spiritual and of the best way to gain such an experience of the spiritual grew out of these two men's profoundly different experience and understanding of God. Hank believed in a rather vague universal power. He was one a universal power you needed to keep in tune with. It was very, very different from Bill Wilson's concept. Hank might best be called a deist. The deists believed that God created the universe. He was the creator God, but then he went away and had nothing whatsoever to do with human affairs past that point. Bill, on the other hand, believed in a providential supreme being. This is really, really, really important to where we're going with we agnostics. A God that you could establish a personal relationship, a providential supreme being you could establish a providential relationship, a personal relationship with. One you could pray to. This is what a personal relationship boils down to, one you would pray to for help, and one who would then give you the help that you'd asked for. So while writing We Agnostic, Bill threaded his way through this impossible controversy between the huge Oxford group contingent in Ohio and even the Christian contingent in New York City, and Hank Parkhurst and Dr. Silkworth going for this moral psychology solution. And he did it in a way that he did with so many other conflicts during the flying blind period by going with what had worked for him personally. That's what, when all else fails, let's go back to what worked for me. And that's really what Bill was doing here. And what had worked for Bill was a providential God who wasn't necessarily Christ or even explicitly Christian, but it was a providential God for sure. And it is this not necessarily Christian, but very providential God that we will find throughout We Agnostics. An important perspective to keep in mind anytime you want to read this chapter. It's not necessarily a Christian God, but it is in fact a providential God. As already noted, Bill started writing more about alcoholism in We Agnostics on September 15th, 1938. And just 12 days later, not even 2 weeks later, 12 days later on September 27th, he had rough drafts finished of both of these chapters, and he sent them to Dr. Bob Smith. His September 27th letter to Bob Smith says, 2 more chapters of the book are close to completion. I am enclosing the original dictation on 2 of them so you can get a rough idea. You will understand that what I am sending you is just the rough, uncorrected outline of those 2 chapters. We'll let you have the polished product when ready. Note the bill says that these are original dictations and rough, uncorrected outlines of the 2 new chapters. Just like the earliest drafts of There Is a Solution and Bill's Story that we've seen in earlier presentations. But the 2 earliest versions of these new chapters and of all the later chapters in the big book have been lost. So we don't have those earliest versions as we do for Bill's Story and There Is a Solution. The earliest surviving examples we have of any of these other chapters in the big book are found in the mid-February 1939 multilith copy. Bill continues his letter to Bob. He says, look, the chapter more about alcoholism seems to meet with general approval. See if you can think of some other points which should have been covered in it. The chapter We Agnostics. All right, we're down to what we're talking about today. Well, chapter We Agnostics, I don't like so much. It seems it's still too preachy and rather disconnected. Given how preachy so many current members find the final polished version of We Agnostic to be, it's hard to imagine just how much more preachy this original dictation might have been, but that's the realm of speculation. Bill then suggested to Bob that one way to make it less preachy, this is Bill's suggestion here, is it might be better done on an entirely different basis in the form of a dialogue between one of our former agnostics and a tough-minded bird lying in a hospital bed. She says, what do you think about that, Bob? Should we do that sort of a thing? Now, I'm speculating here that this suggestion likely came from Hank Parker's speculation, who, despite Bill's efforts certainly throughout this process, always seemed to be pushing for a more literary approach to the big book. All you have to do is take a look at Hank's story in the big book, and it's very, very a literary attempt. So I just can't imagine Bill Wilson trying to write the equivalent of a Platonic dialogue between a former agnostics and a tough-minded bird lying in a hospital bed. Might be interesting to read, though. We've already talked about the next few sentences in this letter in the presentation, the last presentation, more about alcoholism, but I feel they are important and worth repeating here because they are so explicitly contradict the AA myth that the big book was a collaborative project written by 100 men. It was not. It was written by Bill Wilson with input that he did or didn't take from other people. Bill closes this September 27th letter to Bob Smith by advising him perhaps it would be well not to show everybody these chapters. Don't show these things to everybody out there in Ohio, except where you think people can contribute some new ideas which can be incorporated into the final right. So there's still this pushback out in Ohio by a lot of the members in Ohio to the whole book project in general. They're just negative on the whole thing. In other words, Bill says, I know some people out there are opposed to this project, so don't bother showing these chapters to them. Let's not get those guys involved with it. I also think it's important to repeat just how different this is from what Bill had suggested to Bob just 3 months earlier when he sent out the first 2 chapters, Bill's story, and There Is a Solution, of the big book. In late June, when he sent his own story, and There Is a Solution, out to Ohio, Bill had written, the foregoing are suggestions only, the first 2 chapters written. We can never tell where the next best idea may come from and who will make the still better suggestion. So please take the picture I have sketched and do not hesitate to add, subtract, or multiply it in any way that occurs to you all. Yeah, I am not suffering at the moment from any pride of authorship, so let everyone do their best, and if they like their worst. It might be a good idea if you showed this stuff around generally and then asked people to write their own stories. But by late September, that was late June, this is late September now, Bill's no longer looking for advice from everyone out in Akron. He's only interested in hearing from those who have positive things to contribute to the book project. He says, again from that letter, perhaps it would be well not to show everybody these chapters, except where you think people can contribute some new ideas which can be incorporated in the final right. He says, now I suspect, and I speculate, I'm speculating here, that the difference between Bill's open June invitation for feedback and his reluctance for any feedback, from any negative kind of feedback in September, was driven by his fear that the Akron alcoholic squad of the Oxford group would be appalled by the lack of any specific Oxford group practices being mentioned in We Agnostics, which Bill had very, very pointedly avoided, as I've already explained. And I think Bill was worried that if he got feedback from those people, they would just be insisting that he put more specific Oxford group stuff into that chapter, something he was not about to do. Again, my suspicions and my speculations on why there was this difference between the June open invitation and his reluctance in September. Certainly, Bob Smith thought that something should be added to We Agnostics. Bob did write a letter back to him. But we don't have that letter. We lost that letter. We don't have the letter that he makes these suggestions to Bill, but we do have Bill's next letter to Bob that he wrote 5 weeks later on November 3rd. And in that, he says to Dr. Bob, I agree that the chapter of the Agnostics should be longer and perhaps somewhat different in character. So clearly, Bob Smith had gotten back to Bill Wilson after he read the first rough drafts, the rough outlines of those two chapters, and most especially the agnostic chapter, that Bob thought it should be longer and somewhat different in character. Was Bob perhaps suggesting that the longer and different in character version of We Agnostics should include the 4 absolutes of the Oxford group, the 4 basic spiritual practices, sharing, restitution, surrendering, and listening to God of the Oxford group, the 5 C's of the Oxford group: confidence, confession, conviction, conversion, and continuance. Now, these things are the foundational Oxford group practices, and they're so central and essential to the program of recovery that was then being practiced out in Ohio. So was Bob suggesting those things? I have no way of knowing unless Bob's early October letter to Bill does someday surface, which is always a possibility, but it's clear from Bill's letter that Bob had suggested We Agnostics should be, quote, longer and, quote, different, of a different character, whatever that might actually mean. It needed to be longer and different in character from what Bill had written in that original dictation sent to Bob Smith on September 27th. However, if including an explicit Oxford group, or at least a Christian slant to the chapter, was what Bob Smith, or perhaps somebody else, if what Bob Smith was suggesting, and that possibility is just speculation on my part, I have no evidence to back that up, Bill Wilson certainly never took that suggestion to heart. He did not incorporate any explicit Christian, and most especially no explicit Oxford group details in the chapter to We Agnostics. While Bill Wilson was now committed to writing a book that would present their cure for alcoholism to the world, once he started writing on September 15th, he was in with this project. The promise of publishing the article in This Week magazine, which had relaunched the whole Big Book project in the first place, flounders and finally dies. So the reason that Bill started writing again, Hank lighting a fire under him so he could have more chapters for this article in This Week magazine, completely goes away. It just that article never happens. And once again, these guys are faced with the prospect of having no money whatsoever. Hank Parkhurst has another one of his grand ideas. Hank's always got another great idea. In October, they formed their own company, the 100 Men Corporation. Now, Bill always said it was called Works Publishing, but the Works Publishing name doesn't show up until mid-February of 1939. In the beginning, it was called the 100 Men Corporation. And he starts selling shares of stock for $25 a share. And this is going to provide enough money to support the Parkhurst family while the book is being prepared. There are several setbacks and many complications with this 100 Men company. Let's sell shares of stock for $25. And I've covered some of that in more detail and more about alcoholism, and even more so in my book. But the stock eventually does begin to sell. There's all kinds of problems and complications, but it does eventually start to sell, and allowing Hank to keep his head above water during the critical final months as the book is being written, edited, and published. At the same time, Charles Towns commits to pay Bill Wilson $300 a month for 5 months. Bill's broke. He needs some money. If he's going to write the book, he's got to have some money. And that 5 months at $300 equals the $1,500 exactly that Harper Brothers had offered them. So this is a pretty good deal, because they're not selling their rights to the book for the $1,500 to Harper Brothers. They're going to keep the rights to the book, and Charles Towns is going to loan him. It was understood to be a loan, and it was paid back $1,500, $300 a month for 5 months, so that Bill can devote himself to writing the rest of the big book. And the first check from Charles Towns arrives on October 14, 1938. November 1938, Hank Parkhurst and Ruth Haack attend a writing school at New York University, and they both now feel they are even more qualified than they were before to critique Bill's writing. And Bill later commented that he didn't go for Hank's advice very much. You got two alpha guys in this small little office in Newark, New Jersey. Just I'd love to be a fly on the wall for some of those arguments. Bill not going for Hank's advice very much. By November 3rd, 1938, Bill's written 3 new chapters. So he had 2 chapters on September 27th, and now on November 3rd, he's got 3 new chapters, working with others, 2 wives, and the family afterwards. And he sends them to Dr. Bob, along with updated versions of More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics. And he writes to Dr. Bob on November 3rd. He says, I'm enclosing you 5 chapters, 2 of which, More About Alcoholism and We Agnostics, 2 of which you have already seen in the rough. All these can be improved a lot. I am turning this stuff out as fast as I can, being only once corrected dictations. You can't call it serious writing. After I get through with these general chapters on the present basis, I will edit them as carefully as I can, bearing in mind the criticisms and suggestions from anyone who wants to make them. So you might be showing this stuff around, asking people what they really think. He says, I find it pretty hard to get people to voice their opinions. There's a shocking statement. I find it pretty hard to get people to voice their real opinions, as they are too much afraid of hurting the author's feelings. So I wish you would make a special effort to get people to speak their minds. In my opinion, the stuff I have done is not always clear. It's sometimes too long-winded and may not always be the best possible presentation. So I wish you would tell people to speak up or forever hold their peace. I hope to get out there about December 1st for a week or 2 so we can cover these matters better. Bill did not make it out in the beginning of December. He actually didn't get out to Ohio until March of 1939. Note that he's once again changed his mind on who should be seeing these new chapters. So he says, I will edit them as carefully as I can, bearing in mind the criticisms and suggestions from anyone who wants to make them. Anyone who wants to make them. So you might be showing this around, asking people, let's get everybody into the act here. Bill's now given Bob an open-ended invitation to be showing this stuff around to anyone who wants to comment, and to tell people, he wants Bob to tell people that now is the time to speak up if you got any criticisms, suggestions. So I wish you would tell people to speak up or forever hold their peace. You want to have an opinion expressed about this big book. Now is the time to do it, because we are going towards the printing of this thing very, very soon. Also of extreme importance to the 100 men wrote this book mythology is Bill's comment that I find it pretty hard to get people to voice their real opinions, as they are too much afraid of hurting the author's feelings. Note that Bill wrote this on November 3rd. He writes this to Bob Smith on November. He says, people just aren't really giving me much input here. Some, but not much. And the book project on November 3rd is already 5 months old and less than 2 months away from being done. We're 2 months away from the whole thing being wrapped up and done. November 4th, 1938, the day after Bill sends these 5 chapters out to Dr. Bob, Hank hires Janet Blair as one of the book's 2 text editors. Hank is functioning as the managing editor for the entire book project. Now, he's already secured Tom Usel's services to be the other editor. So we have 2 editors of the big book going forward. Usel, he's going to take the macro view of the whole text. He's the guy who looks at the whole big picture and moves things around. He gets Bill's story moved to the front of the book, for instance. And Janet Blair is going to work on the chapters themselves. She's going to be in the sentences, paragraphs, and pages of each individual chapter, making suggestions and comments. On November 9th, just 6 days, so he sends the chapters out, the 5 chapters out to Dr. Bob on November 3rd. November 9th, 6 days after he sends those 5 chapters out, Bill writes to Bob, and he's complaining about the lack of response from Ohio. He's not getting much out of the New York people, and now he's complaining. He says, "Glad to hear you like the chapters, Bob. I sent you, but I really wish you would be more critical of them, for I think they could be improved a lot. Glad to hear you like the chapters I sent you. I wish you would be more critical of them. I have but 2 more of the general chapters to write, and then I shall come out." Later, Bill Wilson said that he had sent chapters on the big book out to Ohio for debate and inspection. Now, this is like more evidence about the fact that we're not getting anything out of Ohio on this. Bill said that he sent chapters of the big book to Ohio for debate and inspection, but that Dr. Bob had never passed them around very much, merely writing me saying he thought they were all right. Merely writing me saying he thought they were all right. Confirming this complete lack of input from Ohio, or what should and should not be printed in the big book, Bill later wrote in Alcoholics Anonymous Comes of Age that he had sent repeated requests to Dr. Bob for him to check and critique those new chapters of the big book, but that the Ohio members had sent back, quote, "nothing but the warmest support." Nothing but the warmest support. That's what one of the things we would call that is damning something with faint praise. They sent back nothing but the warmest support. So, just to say it again, both of these earliest versions of We Agnostic, the September 27th and the November 3rd version, have been lost. We don't have those things. I would love, I think most people would love to see those original versions of that chapter, either one of those. The earliest version we have of We Agnostics that we have is found in the pre-publication multilith copy printed in mid-February of 1939. Now, we've talked about this a couple of times in past presentations, but it's a wonderful, wonderful source of seeing the original text, such as it was in mid-February 1939, and the changes that get made before the book gets published in April 10th of 1939. Because we do not have these 2 earliest versions or any other interval versions, we have no way of tracing whatever changes were made to We Agnostics between September 27th and November 3rd and the printing of the multilith copy in mid-February of 1939. But it would be reasonable to expect that the changes made to this chapter between September 27th and the printing of the multilith copy in mid-February 1939 were likely as extensive as the many changes we've already seen being made to Bill's story, and There Is a Solution, after the first version was written. Probably even more so on this particular chapter, I would think. Again, speculation on my part. Less than 2 months before the big book was printed, the multilith copy was released to ensure that there was no grave errors in the text of the big book before it went to press, and the copies of that were distributed to all of the sober alcoholics. Everybody got one of these things. They went to the doctors and psychiatrists and ministers and priests for review, comments, and corrections. Suggestions came in from many quarters within and without the program, many of which were taken and many of which were rejected. Hank Parkhurst is the guy who wrote down all these comments and suggestions and corrections in one single multilith copy held in the Newark, New Jersey Office of Honored Dealers. And that has been printed in facsimile in a book called The Book That Started It All, which was published in 2010 by Hazelton. If you've got any kind of abiding interest in early Alcoholics Anonymous history, I would seriously recommend you buy yourself a copy of this book. It's fascinating. But once the text of We Agnostics was available for comments in the multilith copy, there are only a few significant changes suggested to that chapter. Surprising to me, at least, that there were so few changes made to that chapter. When we get to the next written chapter, Working with Others, there's just a host of changes being made to the chapter. But in this particular chapter, there wasn't that much critique going on. Very surprising. This is what the first page of We Agnostic looks like in this original. So here's just a few things happening in this. And that's got all the markups suggested by the pre-publication readers. And on the first page, at the very top, it says, in Hank's handwriting, it says, anyone who has enough belief to be curious has inherently enough faith to be cured, a prominent neurologist has said to us. So that's one of his suggestions of going into the text, which was not taken. And then farther down on the first page, at the end of the second paragraph, it had originally read, I like this one, it said originally read, to be doomed to an alcoholic hell or be saved, quotation marks, scare quotes, not easy alternatives to face. So they're going to change this. And why are they going to change this? Because we're talking about hell and being saved. Those are both very, very specific religious terms. And they decide that that's a little bit too much religiosity, if you will, in the text. So that gets changed to be doomed to an alcoholic death rather than alcoholic hell, or to live on a spiritual basis as opposed to being saved. Not always easy alternatives to face. Nice edit there. This is what the second page it looks like with all the markups. And again, all this stuff seems to be at the top. And again, it's not really substantive on any kind of level in the way that the hell and doomed and spiritual was a change. The top half of that second page seems to suggest that this entire body, 2 paragraphs, should be put back in a Bill's story somehow. It didn't happen. And just below that on the second page are a number of edits removing the directive yous and substituting the more suggestive we's. We talked about these are the major edits insisted on by Dr. Howard, the New Jersey psychiatrist that we talked about at some length in the presentation on more about alcoholism. Dr. Howard was saying, look, you can't keep saying to alcohol, you need to do this and you need to do that and you need you can't tell alcoholics anything. What you need to do is say we did this, and when we did this, and this worked for us. Those are the kind of changes, and here they are all over the place in this particular couple of paragraphs in this. And here's the final page of We Agnostic, and there's a bunch of redlining and things going on there. These edits at the top are all about the we language change to subject that we just talked about. That's what's going on there. They're gonna change those things around so that it reads more suggestive rather than directive. And then I love this. Here's a suggestion that was made to change Fitz's great thought to read, who am I to say there is no God? So they're scratching out, who are you? And someone's suggesting, who am I? But then that gets scratched out and they go back to, who are you? It gets put back in. And then at the very bottom of the original, it says, draw near to him and he will disclose himself to you. Again, it's a you statement, which gets changed into, when we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. And according to Hank's little note there at the very bottom of the page, that was approved by Dr. Howard and by Bill Wilson. Bill had become he had been crystal clear, and there is a solution. The solution he was offering to the suffering alcoholic was a spiritual one that would necessarily involve a lot of talk about God. He'd been real clear about that when he wrote there is a solution. And after almost 4 years of experience, he knew that most drunks would rebel against that kind of a solution. Here's a great line out of the original version of There Is a Solution that got taken out. He said, so this is a typical drunk's reaction to this God solution. Oh, so that's what it is. I am so disappointed. I had begun to think that you fellows knew what you were talking about. I don't want to be going down that God road. Good Lord, get me out of here. Knowing that this was going to be a typical reaction from most drinking alcoholics who were thinking about doing something about their drinking problem, he brilliantly titled this chapter, We Agnostics. Inclusive again, We Agnostics. He didn't call it The Agnostic. He didn't call it You Agnostics. And he didn't call it the Agnostic's Dilemma. He called it We Agnostics. Bill Wilson, great writing there. In the first few paragraphs of We Agnostic, Bill notes that almost half of the current members, the sober members of AA, were agnostics or atheists to begin with. That's the justification for the we. But he says that they all finally realized that they had, quote, an illness which only a spiritual experience could conquer. A spiritual experience could conquer. And that they must find, quote, a spiritual basis of life or else. So this is the experience of, half of us were atheists or agnostics when we came into the program. And what did we have to come to a realization about if we wanted to get sober? And that we had to realize that only a spiritual experience could conquer our alcoholism and a spiritual basis of life, or else keep drinking. In some of the most famous sentences to be found in the Big Book, Wilson writes, lack of power. That was our dilemma. We had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. So we're gonna be doing a whole bunch of different euphemisms for this providential God that Bill's going to be talking about, and most especially when he tries to tone it down as far as he can. I suspect, again, speculation, this was one of Hank Parker's pushes to get different and softer ways of it, power greater than ourselves. Obviously, we had to find a power by which we could live, and it had to be a power greater than ourselves. Obviously. Wilson says it's obvious. It's obvious. You can't do it by yourself. How's that been going for you, But how and where to find this power? Well, Bill says that's exactly what this book is about. We're going to tell you how to find that power. Its main object is to enable you to find a power greater than yourself that will solve your problem. That means we have written a book which we believe to be spiritual as well as moral, and it means, of course, that we are going to talk about God. So fasten your seatbelts and get over it. But before exploring what Bill had to say about the God idea, which is really what the rest of this chapter is about, it's essential to understand the historical context. You've got to always be paying attention to the historical context, and here the historical context in which this book and this chapter were written were really, really essential to understanding we agnostics. Today's members often have a much, much, much more liberal understanding of God as we understand him, which they bring to their reading of this particular chapter. And it's very, very different. That liberal understanding is completely different from what Bill Wilson thought and meant when he wrote this book. Bill is not urging the reader to adopt a power greater than yourself that might be a group of drunks, G-O-D, or good orderly direction, or a gift of desperation, or even the great outdoors. And let alone, he's certainly not suggesting some sort of inanimate objects that pop up every so often at AA meetings and conversations as the doorknob or the Fifth Avenue bus. We're not talking about any of those things. Bringing that sort of liberal understanding of the God idea to we agnostics produces nothing but massive confusion. And that's because the basic premises informing this chapter are completely alien to that really, really liberal understanding of God as we understand him. However much that liberal understanding has been responsible for AA's success over the past few decades. It's what you find in AA meetings all over the place these days, but you don't find it in the chapter We Agnostics. To make any reasonable sense of We Agnostics requires acknowledging and understanding the two basic religious and cultural presumptions. This is the context, the religious and cultural presumptions that Bill Wilson brought to the writing of this chapter and to this book. And it's basically the religious and cultural presumptions that he held throughout the rest of his life. The first of Bill's presumptions that are deeply ingrained in the American culture in 1938 and in the lives of the earliest members of Alcoholics Anonymous, is that God is the only way for the alcoholic to access the spiritual. In short, spiritual equals God, God equals spiritual. That's the story. In October of 1938, Bill Wilson had no inkling and no interest in the much broader Eastern, for instance, concept of spirituality, none of which include any notion of a supreme being. Supreme being is very much a Western monotheistic concept. Bill's second presumption, which is absolutely essential to properly understanding this chapter, is that you can believe in any kind of God you want to believe in. God as we understand him, any kind of God you want to believe in, just so long as that God is a providential God. Providential God. What's a providential God? The solution depends on forming a personal relationship with a God that you can pray to and then get direct help from. A providential God. So you can believe in any kind of God you want, any kind of providential God you want. So there's no deist God being offered here or talked about here or being suggested here. Deist God has nothing to do with his creation. Basically what Hank Parkhurst believed. Sorry, Hank, that's not the God we're talking about. No pantheistic God. Pantheist God is like everything in the universe is God. That's the embodiment of God. So sorry, Spinoza and Albert Einstein, both of whom believed in pantheistic gods. No group of drunks, no good orderly direction, no gift of desperation, no great outdoors, and most especially no doorknobs and no Fifth Avenue buses. Again, the solution depends on forming a personal relationship with whatever providential God you might want to believe in, and then asking him for help with your drinking problem, firmly confident that he will restore you to sanity and that you will never again insanely pick up that first drink. These two basic but unspoken foundation stones of We Agnostics could not be more bluntly or pointedly stated than in this 1948 pamphlet that got printed out of Chicago. I love this. All that is required is a recognition of a supreme being which would help us were he sincerely petitioned. So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a providential supreme being who we can pray to and who's going to help us. With those two basic presumptions firmly in mind, the rest of this chapter, disconnected as it may seem to be, which is what Bill Wilson actually said to Dr. Bob in one of those letters, becomes much, much, much less confusing. After Bill's opening attempt to win the reader's confidence, the rest of We Agnostic presents a lively collection of arguments for accepting the God idea. So after he says we agnostics and says half of us were in this boat, so pay attention to us, we were guys just like you. Now he's going to go into his arguments. Bill begins by trying to sell the suffering alcoholic on his need to lay aside prejudice and become open enough to adopt a genuine, quote, willingness to believe in a power greater than ourselves. An unprejudiced willingness is all that is needed to start you on the road to recovery. So we're going to start real low here. Tell you what the minimum requirement is. Unprejudiced willingness. In the past, he said, preachers have demanded that you adopt their version of God. But we're not asking you to accept anyone's version of God. We just want you to become willing. We want you to become willing to have some faith in a power greater than yourself. And that can be any version of God that you feel comfortable with. I believe that Bill's constant emphasis on willingness in this section comes directly from his reading of William James' 1898 book, The Will to Believe, in which the great American pragmatist argued that we are free to adopt any belief as long as it works for us. He's not looking doesn't want to argue over whether this is true or not true. What he wants to be paying attention to, what James pays attention to, is what works for us. If it works for you, it's true. This is the book, 1897, The Will to Believe. The first essay in this book is called The Will to Believe. It's 31 pages long. It's a short thing. I believe Bill Wilson actually could have made his way through that. And I would advise anyone interested in where AA came from to carefully study what William James had to say on this particular topic in this particular essay in this particular book. James's essay in that book wholeheartedly endorses now this is a quote from James, the lawfulness of a voluntarily adopted faith. It's okay. You just need to be willing and adopt something. And then he says, it is his, quote, long defended justification of faith, a defense of our right to adopt a believing attitude in religious matters, our right to adopt a believing attitude in religious matters, in spite of the fact that our merely logical intellect may not have been coerced. Could there possibly be a more accurate description of Bill Wilson's advice to believe in a power greater than yourself as seen throughout We Agnostics then? And here's what he says, we need to ask ourselves but one short question. Do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe or is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. Pure William James. I continue to question how closely Bill Wilson ever read James's masterwork on religion, the varieties of religious experience, but I do believe he made a careful study of this short essay by William James called The Will to Believe. Very interesting reading for any AA member, in my opinion. So having identified what he argues is a very, very low threshold for belief, just a little willingness to believe, adopting a stance of open-minded willingness is all you need. Bill then launches into his laundry list of good reasons for why the reader should believe in a power greater than himself. He begins by appealing to the scientifically minded reader. Wilson points out that today people believe in many scientific truths, like electricity, for which there is no good evidence, quote, for which there is good evidence, but no perfect visual proof. And then he says, scientists tell us that that steel girder is nothing but a mass of electrons just whirling around all the time. We got no visual proof for that, but people believe that. People take that on faith. Electricity, has anybody seen electricity? No. They have no visual proof of that particular element, but we all believe in it. So just as there are precise laws of science, like those electrons and electricity, that hold true throughout the material world, quote unquote, despite what our senses tell us, couldn't there also, Wilson argues, couldn't there also be a spiritual element, an all-powerful, guiding creative intelligence underlining and supporting this material world? Something that you can't really see the way you can't see those electrons, but you take it for granted they're there because science tells you it's there. So why don't you look at our behaviors and our success and realize that adopting a willingness to believe in a spiritual element, an all-powerful guiding creative intelligence underlying and supporting this material world, is the first step in your recovery from alcoholism. He challenges the reader by asking if all those wordy books and windy arguments that they are so fond of, the agnostics and atheists are so fond of, really prove that this universe needs no God to explain it. To those things, does that really prove that? Does that prove that? Does it prove that our human intelligence was the last word on this subject? Bill basically says, well, that's pretty an arrogant attitude, don't you think? That's pretty arrogant. Let's face it, he says, the truth is that we agnostics, all those guys, half of our early members, we never gave, until we got to AA, we never gave the spiritual side of life a fair hearing. Didn't do it. For all our talk of our atheist and agnostic talk of tolerance, we were actually completely intolerant when we judged these people of faith who were leading stable, happy, useful, not drunk lives. But look at the people, our AA people who have, number one, come to believe in a power greater than themselves. And then number two, taken a certain attitude towards that power. And number three, committed a few simple steps. All 100 of them have experienced, after doing those simple things, they have experienced, quote, a revolutionary change in their way of living and thinking. In the face of collapse and despair, in the face of the total failure of their human resources, they found that a new power, peace, happiness, and sense of direction flowed into them. In short, it worked for us. William James, it worked for us, and it will work for you too, if only you give it a try. Please. Set aside your prejudice, open your mind, be a little willing here. Pay attention to what's worked for us. Historically, in expanding on his argument, so there's a whole bunch of arguments based on current membership. Then he goes a little historical here on people. He starts talking about Columbus and Galileo and the Wright brothers. And these guys, not only historically, but scientifically, illustrate the pragmatic fact that the spirit of modern scientific inquiry is one characterized by, quote, complete readiness, a complete readiness to throw away any old or unworkable idea. Certainly Columbus, Earth is round, Galileo, the Wright brothers are going to fly. Everybody said you couldn't fly. And they're going to throw out those unworkable theories. They have a complete readiness to do that and to put something new in its place, something that works. Why shouldn't we, he says, apply this same readiness to change our point of view, which those historically important guys and we 100 people have done to solve our human problems? Why wouldn't we have the same readiness to change our point of view? And then he lists the 8, what people call the bedevilments, and he claims that these problems can all be solved, quote, by a simple reliance upon the spirit of the universe. Our old ideas did not work. But the God idea did work. It did work for us, and we're staying sober. You complain, you agnostics and atheists complain and argue that your ideas are all based on logic and something faulty about our ideas, right? Well, Wilson says, no, that's great. We like logic. Yeah, we love logic. Logic is a good thing. Yeah, we believe firmly that our current faith is reasonable, sane, and logical. And that what you call logical, as compared to what we call logical, is really just soft and mushy thinking. And once you take a look at it from the perspective of our experience, you're going to see that you got soft and mushy thinking, whereas we got reasonable, sane, and logical thinking. Having presented almost 10 pages of his best arguments for the God idea, Bill Wilson now goes on for his close. Bill's a salesman, so he's going for his close here. And he says, quote, when we became alcoholics, crushed by a self-imposed crisis, we could not postpone or evade. We had to fearlessly face the proposition that either God is everything or else he is nothing. God either is or he isn't. Big close. What is your choice going to be? What is your choice going to be? Having brought the reader to a place where he could no longer duck the issue of faith, Bill temporarily stops arguing, and he paints this flowery allegorical picture of the bridge of reason, which leads to the desired shore of faith, where friendly hands are stretched out, welcoming those with flagging spirits to the promise of the new land. Billy told Dr. Bob that he thought his earliest version of We Agnostics was rather disconnected, and this shift into the analogy of the bridge of reason, and then quickly, after he finishes with that, goes back into the straightforward argument contrasting faith with the God of reason, certainly seems disconnected to me. I just, my own personal opinion here, when I look at this and try and make sense out of this chapter and understand how it was written and why. But you got to remember that Wilson was trying his best to accommodate valid suggestions being made to him about the big book. People were looking at the stuff he was doing and telling them things. There's no doubt about that. But this whole section where the bridge of reason is coupled with the God of reason arguments certainly reads to me like something that was forced in. It was shoehorned in sometime later in the writing of this particular chapter. But just please note that that's just one man's opinion. That's how this looks to me when I read this chapter critically. Making his final argument for adopting a faith in a power greater than yourself, Wilson challenged the reader again. He says, just try to imagine a world without faith. Come on, give me a break here. You got faith in all kinds of things. And if you do that, you're going to have to admit that it's impossible to say that you have no capacity for faith. Haven't we all been worshipers our whole life of one thing or another? Haven't you been worshiping logic, you know? Bill then states categorically that actually we were fooling ourselves, for deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. And so we finally saw that a faith in some kind of God was a part of our makeup. Having made all of these varied arguments for embracing a saving belief, this is the belief you need to get sober, a saving belief in a power greater than yourself. And many of them were really kind of strident. They were really kind of forceful arguments. He was punching people in the face a couple of times here. Bill now adopts a much gentler tone. He just kind of backs off 3 steps and says, okay. And he admits that for all that, some of these reasons may still not have been convincing enough. He says, I'm doing the best I can here. We can only clear the ground a little bit for you. You gotta come meet us. Maybe we're back to the bridge of reason. You got to get on the bridge of reason and come over. But he says, we've tried to clear the ground a little, but if our testimony helps sweep away prejudice and enables you to think honestly and encourages you to search diligently within yourself, if our testimony accomplishes those 3 things, then if you wish, you can join us on the broad highway. With this attitude, you cannot fail. The consciousness of your belief is sure to come to you. First closing argument, Bill falls back on A's tried and true method. The personal story. We're storytellers, personal storytellers. He tells a story of a man who thought he was an atheist, a man who suffered a spiritual crisis while confined in a hospital. This is Fitz-Mayo's story, which anyone can read in the back of the big book under the title of Our Southern Friend. But Bill gives a little excerpt from Fitz's story here without identifying who it was. He says, in his despair, this guy, this atheist in the hospital, in his despair, he thought, is it possible that all the religious people I have known were wrong? This is Fitz's thought process. Then, like a thunderbolt, a great thought came. It crowded out all else. Who are you to say there is no God? Like a thunderbolt. That man, Fitz-Mayo, fell to his knees. He stood in the presence of an infinite power and love. He had stepped from bridge to shore. We're back to the bridge of reason. His alcoholic problem was taken away, gone. God had restored him to sanity. Even so, has God restored us all to our right minds. To this man, the revelation was sudden. Some of us grow into it more slowly, but he has come to all who have honestly sought him. When we drew near to him, he disclosed himself to us. This is the promise. This is the promise of the chapter, We Agnostics. And with those glowing promises, Bill ends the chapter with a solution as clearly defined as possible here in We Agnostics, as he has hoped the diagnosis has been clearly defined in More About Alcoholism. So there's a package here. There is a solution, diagnosis and solution, followed by More About Alcoholism, all about the diagnosis, followed by We Agnostics, all about the solution. There's a very clear logic to what's going on here in those particular 3 chapters. And that's We Agnostics. You need to adopt a faith in a power greater than yourselves, a power you can pray to and expect to receive help from. You have no mental defense against the insanity of the first drink, but you can get yourself a spiritual defense, and this will clear you of your problems with alcohol. That's the message of those 3 chapters, 1, 2, 3. All you need is willingness. You got to be able to willing to ask yourself in but one short question: do I now believe, or am I even willing to believe, that there is a power greater than myself? As soon as a man can say that he does believe, he is willing to believe, we emphatically assure him that he is on his way. Thank you, Bill. Okay, that finishes my talk on We Agnostics. And going forward, you might expect the next presentation in this series to be about how it works, followed by interaction chapters. We just finished chapter 4, so chapters 5 and 6 are next, right? Wrong. I want to present the chapters in the order in which Bill wrote them. And so just to forewarn you, the next presentation will be about working with others, not about how it works or into action. Thank you. See you in the next presentation.